Before the first equation was ever written, before the first theory of the universe was ever spoken, before the very concept of rational thought had a name, there was one man, one solitary, extraordinary, almost incomprehensible man, standing at the edge of the ancient world, staring into the abyss of the unknown, and daring to ask a question that no human being had ever asked before. Not a prayer, not a myth, not a plea to the gods, just a question, a pure, blazing, a revolutionary question. What is everything made of? That man's name was Thales of Miletus, and what he did next changed the entire course of human civilization forever. But here's what most people don't know. And I promise you, by the end of the story, there is one striking, almost jaw-dropping detail about the man who came after Thales that will completely reframe how you think about the birth of human knowledge. Stay with me, because this story does not end where most people think it ends. Welcome to Numbers and Narratives by Blessright. This is the channel where history breathes, where numbers tell stories, and where the greatest minds who ever walked this earth come alive in ways your textbook never dared to show you. If you are here for the first time, I want you to do one thing right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Because what we do here is not just education. It is a journey, a deep, emotional, soul-stirring journey through the corridors of human genius. And today's story is perhaps the most important journey we have ever taken together. We are going back, all the way back, more than 2,600 years. Back to a time when the world was shrouded in darkness and mythology. Back to when gods ruled every explanation and fear governed every mind. We are going back to the birth of something miraculous, the birth of reason itself, the birth of science, the birth of mathematics as a discipline, the birth of philosophy as a way of life. And we are going to meet the man at the very beginning of it all, Thales of Miletus. And then, in a revelation that will leave you breathless, we are going to meet the man who came right after him, the second, the one history almost forgot, the one whose contribution, when you truly understand it, is so staggering, so ahead of its time, so cosmically ambitious, that you will wonder how any human being alive in 600 BC could have possibly thought such thoughts. And there is a striking detail, a detail that connects Thales and his successor in a way that is both deeply personal and profoundly symbolic, that I am going to reveal at the very end of this video. So I need you to stay. I need you to watch every single second, because the end of this story is where the real fire is. Close your eyes for a moment. When not literally, you are watching a video, but in your mind, I need you to travel back. It is approximately 624 BC. The city of Miletus sits on the western coast of what is now modern-day Turkey, along the shimmering blue-green waters of the Aegean Sea. It is one of the greatest, most prosperous cities in the ancient Greek world. Merchants and sailors pour in and out of its magnificent harbor. Trade routes connect Miletus to Egypt, to Babylon, to Persia, to the far reaches of the known world. Ideas flow in with the cargo. Knowledge arrives with the ships. And in this extraordinary, cosmopolitan, intellectually alive city, a boy is born. His name is Thales. But before we meet Thales as a thinker, we must understand the world he was born into. Because that world, and I cannot stress this enough, was a world completely dominated by supernatural explanation. Every single thing that happened in nature had a divine cause. Thunder? That was Zeus, in hurling his bolts across the sky in divine rage. The sea's fury? That was Poseidon, stirring the depths with his trident. Disease? Punishment from the gods. The movement of the stars? The gods writing messages across the heavens. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, eclipses, all of it, every single terrifying and wondrous thing that nature did, was attributed to the will, the whims, the anger, or the mercy of supernatural beings. This is not a criticism of the ancient people. While this was the rational response of a human mind trying to make sense of a world it did not yet have the tools to understand. If you do not know what causes lightning and the most powerful being you can imagine is a god, then of course lightning comes from the god. It is a logical leap, a wrong one, but a logical one. And for thousands of years, from the earliest days of human civilization in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, on in China, everywhere, the supernatural was the answer to everything that science had not yet answered. Mathematics existed, of course. The Egyptians had been building pyramids for 2,000 years by the time Thales was born. They had practical arithmetic, practical geometry. They could calculate the area of a field, the volume of grain, the slope of a pyramid wall. The Babylonians had remarkable astronomical records, sophisticated numerical systems, and even a basic understanding of what we now call the Pythagorean theorem, centuries before Pythagoras was born. But here is the critical distinction that separates all of that from what Thales would do. All of that knowledge was practical. It was useful. It answered the question, how do we do this specific thing? None of it asked the deeper question. None of it said, why is the universe the way it is? What is the fundamental nature of reality? What is everything, truly, essentially, at its most basic level, made of? That question, that magnificent, terrifying, beautiful, world-altering question, was waiting. It had been waiting for thousands of years, and it was waiting for Thales. The story goes that Thales traveled extensively in his youth. He went to Egypt, where he amazed the Egyptian priests, men of extraordinary learning and deep tradition, by calculating the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza using nothing but shadows. The method was breathtakingly simple and breathtakingly brilliant. He waited for the moment in the day when his own shadow was exactly equal in length to his own height. At that precise moment, he measured the shadow of the pyramid. And because the shadow equaled the height in that magical moment of the day, he knew. The shadow of the pyramid was the height of the pyramid. The priests, by all accounts, were stunned. Here was a man who had taken one of the most awe-inspiring monuments in the history of human construction and measured it, not by divine revelation, not by royal decree, not by magic, but by pure, elegant, rational geometry. He also reportedly learned from the Babylonian astronomical records during his time in the East. He studied the heavens with extraordinary dedication. He learned the patterns, the cycles, the rhythms of the cosmos. He internalized generations of Babylonian skywatching. And then, drawing on everything he had learned, Thales did something that was, at the time, so far beyond what any human being had done before that it must have seemed like sorcery. He predicted a solar eclipse. The year was 585 BC. A total solar eclipse crossed the sky over Asia Minor. But Thales had predicted it. He had calculated, using his knowledge of astronomical cycles, that the eclipse would occur. And it did. The ancient world was electrified. This was not a god. And this was not a prophet receiving divine visions. This was a man, a human being. Using mathematics and observation and rational deduction, he had looked into the machinery of the cosmos and read its schedule. He had, for perhaps the first time in recorded human history, demonstrated that nature operated according to predictable, knowable, rational laws. Laws that a human mind could discover, understand, and use to see into the future. But the eclipse, as magnificent as it was not Thales's most revolutionary act. His most revolutionary act was philosophical. It was the moment he sat down, in the rich intellectual atmosphere of Miletus, surrounded by merchants and scholars and sailors bringing wisdom from every corner of the ancient world. And he asked his great question. He asked, what is the arche? What is the primary substance? What is the one thing from which everything else is made? And his answer? Water. Now I can hear some of you thinking, water? When that is it? That is the great revelation? Water? But I need you to feel the depth of what this answer represented, because the answer itself is almost beside the point. The monumental civilization-changing, history-rewriting significance of this moment was not that Thales said water. It was that Thales gave a natural answer to a question that everyone before him had always answered supernaturally. He did not say the universe was created by Poseidon. He did not say the gods shaped reality from divine material. He said, look around you, observe nature, think, reason. And here is what I believe. I believe everything comes from water. Everything lives in water. Everything returns to water. The earth itself floats on water. Water is the principle. Was he right? No. Of course he was not right. Water is not the fundamental substance of the universe. But the bravery of that answer. The audacity. The intellectual courage it took to stand in a world where every single person around you believed the gods controlled everything, and to say, I think I can explain the universe without the gods. I think nature is enough. I think reason is enough. I think the human mind, properly applied, can unlock the secrets of existence itself. That moment, that single, solitary, courageous moment, is the birth of Western philosophy. It is the birth of what we now call natural science. It is the first time a human being looked at the world not as a stage for divine drama, but as a natural system governed by natural laws. And Thales of Miletus was the man who took that first, terrifying, exhilarating step. The ancient world recognized this. Thales became one of the legendary 7 sages of ancient Greece, a group of 7 men celebrated across the centuries as the wisest, most enlightened human beings of the archaic era. To be listed among the 7 sages was to be considered not merely learned, but transcendently wise, the kind of wisdom that could counsel kings, arbitrate between cities, guide a civilization through its most critical decisions. And Thales led the list. He was, for the ancient Greeks, the wisest of the wise. He is credited with a series of geometric theorems that bear his name to this day. Thales's theorem, which states that if you take any 2 points on a diameter of a circle and draw lines to any point on the circumference, you will always get a right angle. He understood the properties of isosceles triangles. He applied geometric reasoning to practical problems of navigation and land measurement in ways that had never been systematically done before. He was the first person in the Western tradition to prove mathematical theorems, not just use mathematical results, but to ask why they were true and to provide logical demonstrations. He is also said to have made a small fortune in olive oil. The story goes that one winter, Thales used his astronomical and meteorological knowledge to predict that the coming spring would bring an exceptionally good olive harvest. So he quietly contracted for the use of all the olive presses in Miletus and Chios at a low winter price. When the great harvest came, exactly as he had predicted, I know everyone needed the presses at once, and Thales had them all. He made as much money as he chose. When asked about this, he is said to have smiled and replied that it was easy for philosophers to be rich if they chose, but that was not what interested them. It was a statement of both supreme confidence and perfect detachment. He had proven the point that wisdom could command the practical world whenever it chose to, and then walked away from the money because the pursuit of knowledge was what truly mattered. There is a more famous story about Thales, one that has been told for 2,600 years, one that has been used both to mock him and to exalt him. The story says that Thales was walking one night, gazing up at the stars, contemplating the heavens, when he fell into a well. A servant girl, in some versions a Thracian maid, laughed at him. "Here is this man," she said, "who claims to understand the stars and the heavens, and he cannot even see what is at his own feet." The story has been used for centuries to tease philosophers, heads in the clouds, blind to the practical world. But the great philosopher Plato turned the story on its head. He said that the girl was the one who was wrong. She could only see what was at her feet. Thales could see the entire cosmos. And the difference between them was not that Thales was absent-minded. It was that his mind was in a place that hers could never reach. Let us now understand what we mean when we say that Thales was the first mathematician, the first scientist, and the first philosopher. Because these are not casual claims. These are among the most consequential attributions in the entire history of human intellectual achievement. When we say first mathematician, we mean the first person in the Western tradition to treat mathematics not merely as a collection of useful tricks and practical procedures, but as a discipline of proof, a domain where you do not just know that something is true, but you can demonstrate why it must be true, why it could not possibly be otherwise, why the logic itself makes it inevitable. Thales brought the spirit of proof to geometry. He asked not just what, but why. And that question, that insistence on demonstration rather than just calculation, is what separates mathematics from accounting. It is what separates Euclid from a tax collector, and Thales started it. When we say first scientist, We mean the first person to insist that natural phenomena have natural explanations. The first person to look at the world and say, there is a rational order here, a lawful order, and an order that my mind can uncover if I observe carefully enough and think clearly enough. He did not invoke the gods to explain the earthquake. He said, perhaps the earth floats on water, and when the water is disturbed, the earth shakes. He was wrong about the mechanism, but the methodology, look for natural causes of natural effects. That is science. That is the scientific worldview. And Thales inaugurated it. When we say first philosopher, we mean the first person in the recorded Western tradition to pursue wisdom systematically, to make the love of wisdom the relentless pursuit of fundamental truth, the central project of a human life. Philosophy literally means love of wisdom, and Thales was the first person to live that love publicly, visibly, consequentially, to build a school around it, to attract students, and to set in motion a chain of intellectual inheritance that would run from Miletus, through Athens, through Alexandria, through Rome, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, all the way to our own day. Because here is what Thales did that was perhaps even more important than his own ideas. He started a school. He attracted students. He created an intellectual community, a place where questioning was not just permitted, but celebrated, where ideas could be challenged and refined and improved, where one generation's best thoughts became the foundation for the next generation's even better thoughts. He created in Miletus perhaps the first scientific and philosophical school in Western history, and that school, and the Milesian school, produced two more extraordinary thinkers who built upon Thales's foundation in directions that he himself might never have imagined. And this is where our story takes its great turn. Because if Thales is the first mathematician, scientist, and philosopher, and he is, then who is the second? The answer is a name that fewer people know, but a mind that was, in some ways, even more daring than Thales himself. The second is Anaximander of Miletus. Anaximander was born around 610 BC in Miletus, the same city as Thales. He became a student of Thales. He sat at the feet of the first philosopher, absorbed everything the master taught, and then, as the very greatest students always do, he went further. He did not just accept Thales's answers. He challenged them. He pushed past them. He opened doors that Thales had not even known were there. And what he found behind those doors was so astonishing, so radically ahead of its time, that when modern scientists and philosophers read Anaximander's ideas, they are sometimes struck speechless. Anaximander heard Thales say that everything was made of water, and he thought about it. He really thought about it. And he said, respectfully but firmly, no. Water cannot be the fundamental substance. And here is why. Water is already something specific. Water is wet. Water is cold. Water is a particular thing. But if the fundamental substance of everything already has specific qualities, then how do you explain the existence of its opposites? How do you explain fire, which is the opposite of water? If everything comes from water, why does fire exist at all? Why does dryness exist? Why does heat exist? The very existence of opposites, wet and dry, hot and cold, light and dark, means the fundamental substance cannot already be one of them. So Anaximander proposed something utterly revolutionary. He said the fundamental substance, what he called the apeiron, which means the boundless, the indefinite, the unlimited, was not any specific, identifiable substance at all. It was something prior to all specific substances, something without qualities, without limits, without form, an eternal, inexhaustible source from which all specific things emerge through a process of separation, and to which all specific things eventually return. The hot separates from the cold, the wet separates from the dry. Opposites emerge from the undifferentiated boundless, collide and interact and create the world we see, and eventually dissolve back into the apeiron from which they came. Stop and think about what Anaximander just said. He said the fundamental substance of reality is not a thing you can see or touch or taste or measure. It is prior to all things you can see or touch or taste or measure. It is the ground of existence itself, the infinite, formless, eternal source from which everything that exists has emerged and to which everything that exists will return. He described something that modern physicists might almost recognize as a description of the quantum vacuum, the seething, energetic, when undifferentiated ground state of the universe, from which particles and fields emerge and into which they dissolve. He was thinking thoughts in 600 BC that would not be matched in their cosmological audacity until the 20th century. But that is not all. Anaximander also gave us what may be the most breathtaking single idea in the history of pre-Socratic philosophy. He actually seriously proposed, that human beings had evolved from other creatures, from fish, or fish-like creatures, from beings that lived in water. He observed that human babies are completely helpless for years after birth, far more helpless than the young of any other animal. He reasoned that if the first human beings had emerged helpless into a hostile world, they would have been immediately eaten and would never have survived long enough to reproduce. Therefore, he argued, the first human beings must have been gestated and nurtured inside some other creature, some sea creature, until they were old enough to survive on their own. And then they emerged fully capable onto the land. He was wrong about the specific mechanism. He could not have imagined natural selection. He could not have known about DNA. He had none of the tools that Darwin had. But the conceptual leap, the idea that human beings had not been placed on the earth in their present form by divine creation, but had instead developed over time from earlier, different sea-dwelling creatures, is one of the most astonishing intellectual leaps in all of human history. It would not be seriously pursued again in Western thought for more than 2,000 years. 2,000 years. And yet Anaximander was there, in 600 BC, looking at the world and thinking, we came from somewhere. We were not always as we are now. We changed. We evolved. Anaximander also made the first map of the world, the very first. He drew, on a surface, probably metal or wood, a representation of the entire known world, with oceans surrounding the continents of Europe and Asia and a landmass to the south. It was crude and inaccurate by modern standards, of course, but it was the first. The first time a human being had tried to represent the entire known world on a single surface. The first attempt at cartography as a systematic intellectual project. The world map, which we now carry in our phones, which astronauts study before missions, which generals spread out on tables before campaigns. It begins with Anaximander of Miletus in the 6th century BC. He also grappled with astronomy in ways that were deeply original. He proposed that the Earth was a cylinder, not flat, and not spherical but a rounded column, suspended freely in space at the center of the universe, not resting on anything. Thales had said the Earth floated on water. Anaximander said the Earth needed no support. It was suspended in space by the principle of equilibrium. There was no reason for it to fall in any direction, because all directions were equal from the center, so it simply stayed. This is a physical argument of extraordinary sophistication. It is, in essence, when the same reasoning that Newton would formalize 2,000 years later when he described gravitational equilibrium. Anaximander got there first, with nothing but pure reasoning. He also proposed a model of the cosmos in which the sun, the moon, and the stars were not gods, not divine beings riding chariots across the sky, but natural phenomena, rings of fire encircling the earth, their light visible through openings in their fiery rings. He was trying to explain celestial mechanics in purely natural terms, to strip the heavens of their divine mystery and describe them as a physical system governed by natural principles. He was, in the fullest and truest sense, doing astronomy. Not astrology, not mythology, not theology, astronomy, natural science of the heavens. In 600 BC, Anaximander also wrote the first known work of prose philosophy in the Western tradition. Before him, wisdom was expressed in poetry, in verse, in epic, in hymn. Thales himself apparently left no written works, and what we know of his ideas comes from later reports and commentaries. But Anaximander wrote. He wrote a book titled, In the Simple Direct Way of Ancient Titles, on Nature. It was a prose treatise, a rational, systematic written argument about the fundamental nature of reality. It was, as far as we can tell, the first work of its kind in the Western world. Almost none of it survives. We have one fragment, one single passage that ancient commentators preserve because they found it so remarkable. And that single fragment speaks of the things that emerge from the Epeiron. They must pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice, in accordance with the ordering of time. Even in that one fragment, the depth and originality of the mind is undeniable. Anaximander thought about the world through the lens of justice, of balance, of a cosmic moral order in which every excess is eventually corrected, every imbalance eventually restored. It is a vision of the universe that is at once scientific and ethical, rational and poetic, ancient and startlingly modern. And now we come to the striking detail I promised you at the beginning, the detail that connects Thales and Anaximander in a way that goes beyond teacher and student, much beyond intellectual inheritance, beyond philosophical succession. The detail that makes this story not just a story about ideas, but a story about human beings, about the most intimate, the most personal, the most enduring of all human relationships. Anaximander was not merely the student of Thales. According to several ancient sources, Anaximander was also a friend of Thales, a close friend, a companion, a collaborator. In the ancient world, the relationship between a great philosopher and his successor was often understood in deeply personal terms. Not just the transmission of knowledge, but the transmission of a way of being, a way of living, a way of facing the cosmos with open eyes and an unafraid heart. Thales did not just give Anaximander ideas. He gave him the courage to push past those ideas. He gave him the permission, the intellectual permission, the human permission, to disagree, to say, "Master, you are wrong." And when Thales, the great Thales, the first philosopher, the wisest of the seven sages, apparently accepted that disagreement with grace, because he knew that the greatest teacher is the one whose student surpasses him. And here is the striking detail. Here is the thing that reaches across 26 centuries and grabs you by the chest and will not let go. There is a tradition, preserved in ancient sources, that Anaximander was born in 610 BC and died around 546 BC. Thales was born around 624 BC and is believed to have died around 546 BC as well. They may have died in the same year, the first philosopher and the second philosopher, the master and the student, the man who started everything and the man who took everything further than it had ever been taken before, together at the beginning, together at the end, two minds that changed the world side by side in the same city, in the same year of both their births and of both their deaths, spanning, between them, the single most intellectually explosive generation in the history of Western thought. If that does not move you, if that does not make the hairs on your arms stand up, if that does not fill your chest with something that feels like awe and grief and wonder all at once, then I do not know what will. What Thales and Anaximander started in Miletus did not stay in Miletus. It spread, it grew, it transformed. Anaximander's own student, Anaximenes, continued the school. Proposing that air was the fundamental substance and developing a more sophisticated account of how physical transformations occur through condensation and rarefaction. After Miletus came the rest of pre-Socratic philosophy, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Zeno, Empedocles, Democritus, each one standing on the shoulders of those who came before, each one taking the great question further, each one refusing to accept the supernatural and insisting that the rational mind could, in principle, understand everything. And then came Socrates, and then came Plato, and then came Aristotle. And from Aristotle came the entire framework of Western science, logic, biology, physics, metaphysics, ethics, and political philosophy. And from that framework came the Library of Alexandria. And from the Library of Alexandria came the transmission of classical learning to the medieval Islamic world. And from the Islamic world came the preservation and enrichment of Greek science during Europe's dark centuries. And from that preservation came the Renaissance. And from the Renaissance came Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler. And from them came Newton. And from Newton came everything. Every equation in every physics textbook, every engineering marvel, every satellite in the sky, every smartphone in your pocket. All of it in an unbroken chain of intellectual inheritance traces back to that harbor city on the Aegean coast, traces back to a man staring into the night sky and asking his impossible question, traces back to Thales of Miletus, and beside him, as always, learning from him, challenging him, pushing past him, and perhaps dying in the same year he died, was Anaximander, the second, the one who proved that the first was not a fluke, that it was not an accident, that what had been born in Miletus was real and alive and unstoppable. There is something I want you to sit with for a moment before we close. These men, Thales and Anaximander, lived in a world without telescopes, without microscopes, without laboratories, without universities, without the internet, without scientific journals, without peer review, without any of the institutional infrastructure that we now take for granted as the scaffolding of knowledge. They had nothing but their minds, their observations, their willingness to question what everyone else accepted, their courage to be wrong in public in pursuit of being right eventually, and with nothing but those things, they changed the world so completely that we are still living in the world they made, a world where we believe that reason can unlock the secrets of nature, that the universe is governed by laws that human minds can discover, that questions are more powerful than prayers, that the willingness to say, "I do not know," is the beginning of all genuine wisdom. Think about what it means to be the first, to stand at the absolute beginning of something, to have no one to follow, no precedent to consult, no tradition to draw from, no reassurance that what you are doing is not completely mad. Thales had nothing to point to. No one had ever done what he was doing. He was making it up in the best and highest sense, creating something where nothing existed before. One of that is not just intelligence, that is courage. That is the rarest, most precious form of human courage. The courage to think a thought that no one has ever thought before. And Anaximander? Anaximander had one thing Thales did not have. He had a master. He had an example. He had proof that it could be done. And that may be why he was able to go further, because he did not have to spend his courage on the first step. The first step had already been taken. His courage could go toward the second step, and the third and the fourth. He could stand on Thales's foundation and reach for the sky. This is the way knowledge works. This is the way human progress works. The first person takes the hardest step, the step into the void, the step with no safety net, the step that could make them a laughingstock or a legend. And then the second person, inspired, empowered, and yes, challenged by the first, takes the next step. And so it goes. Down through the centuries, down through the generations, down through the long, extraordinary, heartbreaking, and glorious story of human beings trying to understand the universe they were born into. Thales of Miletus started it. Anaximander of Miletus continued it. And every scientist, every mathematician, every philosopher who has ever lived, whether they know it or not, whether they have ever heard the name Miletus or not, is a child of that school, is a descendant of that tradition. One is carrying in their mind and in their work the flame that was lit on the shores of the Aegean Sea more than 2,600 years ago by two men who looked at the world and refused to be afraid of it. That is the story of Thales of Miletus, the first mathematician, the first scientist, the first philosopher, and Anaximander of Miletus, the second, the student who became a giant, the inheritor who expanded the inheritance beyond all recognition, and the man who, if the ancient sources are right, began and ended his extraordinary life in the same years as the master who made impossible. If this story moved you, if it gave you chills, if it made you want to read more, if it made you feel, even for a moment, the full weight and wonder of what these men did, then please do something for me right now. Hit that like button. Leave a comment below. Tell me what struck you most about this story, what surprised you, what you never knew before. And if you are not yet subscribed to Numbers and Narratives by Blessright, then now is the moment. Subscribe, ring that bell, because we are just getting started. The history of mathematics, science, and philosophy is the greatest story ever told. And we are going to tell every single chapter of it together. I will see you in the next one.